There's a new car on the market that's being built in Poland right now that I would say is even better than the Citroen EC3 or the Dacia Spring EV. And even though it's been manufactured on European soil, I think there's still a big risk that this car will be taxed under the new Chinese EV tariffs for cars imported from China into the EU that are being introduced in the EU in July this year. So this car, I think, is a real foot in the door for Europe's small, affordable EV market, and it seemingly ticks every box, and that for me is why this video is really interesting. So it would be a real shame if this was jeopardized by these tariffs, because I think there's a real chance that it could be, and I think it would hinder the establishment of the genuinely cheap part of the market in Europe, which so far is painfully non-existent, and that it bothers me to say that. But the car I'm talking about is the Leapmotor T03, owned by Stellantis. If you don't know who Stellantis are, you will by the end of the video. Now, if you're a regular viewer, then you know that I'm always talking about how we need more cars on the cheaper end of the market, because not everyone can just go out and buy a Tesla. An ordinary person who works in a shop, for example, down the road, 9 to 5, puts bread on a shelf in a shop for you to go in and buy, they're not looking to spend 40,000 euros on a Tesla. Probably not. They're looking for a smaller practical car, like a 10 or 15,000 euro car. I'll get into the details a bit more in a minute of the T03, but for those of you that are new, I'm Ben Alexander and I make EV news videos every day. So please, if I could ask you to do two things, and this would be really lovely if you could do one or two of them. Could you subscribe for me if you haven't already, and then consider becoming a YouTube member or a Patreon member for as little as $1 a month. Any support really just helps me keep making these videos every day. It's really important to me to try and help establish this bottom end of the market, and I think I'm going to start a free Patreon membership too, which is I just think it's a great idea, and I think that would be quite nice for a lot of people. A few people have asked about it too. I would like to use that as a place, or Patreon really, as a place to connect with the people that watch my videos the most. And you can contact me directly on there and have chats and ask questions and all sorts of stuff. The Leapmotor T03 is precisely the sort of car that I chirp on about literally every month on this channel. It seemingly has all of the boxes ticked. That's the important thing for me. And the important one that we are quite used to being let down by these days is cars on this end of the market not having proper thermal battery management, but this one does. That's the big deal for me, I think. So it's genuinely cheap, not cheap relative to a Tesla, but it's genuinely cheap. The most expensive one is 15,000 euros in France after subsidies, basically. And there is an even cheaper one, which is I think about 1,000 euros cheaper, but it has a smaller range. So it's decent looking, it's all right, and it looks a bit like a squashed down London taxi, which I think is a bit weird. I personally kind of like that quirky, weird little look. It just looks like a cheap, practical car that's meant to get you from A to B cheaply. It's not a showstopper, but it is decent. It has a usable range of 300 to 400, but I think personally, if you go slow, you'll get 350 kilometers on a charge, I think, in Europe. In Europe, there are two power options for it. There are 75 horsepower and 109 horsepower. Most importantly, it has full battery cooling using the liquid technology to extract the heat out of the battery cells, and the AC to actually take that out of the car, which is the important thing. So not passive cooling, as Nissan say. It's actual proper cooling on the batteries for when you're living in, say, Rome or Greece or, I don't know, Nice, for example, in South France. If we compare it to the Dacia Spring, generally a cheaper car than the Leapmotor T03, even after subsidies. The T03, though, is a little bit shorter, a little bit wider, and taller compared to the Spring, and it also weighs a little bit more. The T03 in Europe has the same top speed as the Dacia Spring of 125, not the standard 100 kilometers per hour max speed widely reported, because that's the Chinese top speed, and that was a software thing. The most expensive version of the Leapmotor T03 with the 350 realistic kilometer range after French subsidies, for example, means that it will cost about 15,000 euro after you've paid your registration fees and all that sort of stuff and had your subsidies added up. The T03 car really stands out as genuinely good value, I think, especially when you consider that the Dacia Spring doesn't have nowhere near the range that this car has, the T03, and it also doesn't have any cooling on the battery. So the battery in 5 years will almost certainly be quite a lot less capacity if you live in a hot climate and it sits outside cooking in the sun all day. So the T03, it's basically the first small and well-priced EV that has all of these features in it that is available in Europe until the BYD Seagull comes out in 2025. I think in mid-2025 in Europe, we expect. So the T03 has started actually being produced and rolling off the production line. There are genuine photos of it in Poland, and it will be in full mass production by September. And then in the first quarter of 2025, they will also start producing the SUV from Leapmotor. So as most of you know, the EU currently tax all Chinese imported vehicles at 10%, but they have announced these new taxes, this new tariff coming into effect in early July. These have been decided based on a combination of trade investigations, this thing that was reported on widely for the last 6 months, which was a big folly, basically. I don't think it was a very real investigation at all, but they did some stuff, so they've got some data to show you, but they just said what everyone thought they were going to say anyway. Also some market analysis, manufacturers' adherence to trade rules and regulations, and also how well the manufacturers complied with the investigators and the requests, which is a weird thing, but they did that. They are supposed to protect the European market, or at least that's the reason on paper. To qualify for the higher tax, the car needs to be built in China and then shipped into the European Union as a complete vehicle, and that's how you get taxed this new tariff, like the full tariff of an extra 38.1% on top of the 10%. So EVs that are primarily manufactured or assembled in China, even if they are partially processed in another country, may still be classified as Chinese origin products, which is the important thing. So we're talking about the origin now in this part of the video. We're going to start talking a little bit about the origin of these cars. It's an important part here. So when it comes to the Leapmotor T03, the manufacturing process they have used could allow the vehicles to be classed as European made under certain regulations, depending on the extent of the assembly and the origin of these parts, and also something else which I will get into in a minute. So the Leapmotor T03's ownership is split between Stellantis and Leapmotor. Stellantis, which is a multinational automotive manufacturing corporation, formed in 2021, really big company, and that was formed through the merger of an Italian-American conglomerate, Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, and French PSA Group. So basically, Stellantis is now one of the largest, kind of like Volkswagen and Ford Group in China. It's now one of the largest automakers in the world, with a portfolio of 14 well-known brands, including Peugeot, Citroën, Opel, Fiat, Jeep, and there's a series of others. So Stellantis is a real deal. If you want to build cars and you team up with Stellantis, that's a really big deal. Hence why Stellantis now bought 51% of Leapmotor, the brand, so they can start to help Leapmotor produce their little cheap cars here in Europe, and then we can have them here without having to pay the expensive tax, basically. And also give them a head start with this pretty decent car. They can help just get that out there, basically, and market it and sell it. So like I said, Stellantis formed this joint venture with Leapmotor called Leapmotor International, and Stellantis holds 51% of that. That's the stake that they have. The partnership's goal is to manufacture, export, and sell Leapmotor products outside of China, basically. So as part of this collaboration, Stellantis is leveraging its existing and very extensive manufacturing infrastructure in Europe to assemble Leapmotor vehicles. Specifically, the Leapmotor T03 is the first vehicle, and then there's going to be the SUV in the first quarter of next year. This will be assembled at the Stellantis plant in Tychy, I think you say, in Poland, using the semi-knocked down process, basically. This involves importing partially assembled kits for the vehicles in China, and then they ship those parts over, completing that assembly locally in Poland. And this looks like it's something they've done intentionally to have these cars made in Poland for the purposes of dodging the extra tax because Poland is in the European Union, for example. So the rule of origin is an important thing, I think. The rule of origin will mean that it will be down to the amount of value that is added to the car in the second stage of the manufacturing process in Poland. That is what decides how it's taxed here. So if the majority of the vehicle's value is added in Europe, it might qualify as a European-made vehicle, and it will still need to comply with European regulations, obviously for safety, and it will need to obtain a COC certificate. It's a certificate of conformity. Basically, you can sell this vehicle in Europe if it has a certificate. But that means it meets all EU safety, environmental, and I think manufacturing standards. So even though many would still classify the T03 at this point as a Chinese car, the tops and tails of it is that if they import this car from China, they will pay 31% import tax on it into the European Union. Whereas if they assemble the car in Poland, they should be able to just pay 5% on the component duties. So basically, for buying these little bits of the car, you send the bits over, you pay 5% on them, you build the car, you sell the car. It is a far better deal. So at the moment, it looks like Stellantis has cleverly avoided this 31% tariff, because that's the tariff they've been said to be on if you would just import them from China. This might be great for now, but the whole idea behind the tariffs, at least on the surface anyway, is that the EU they don't want Chinese cars disrupting their market, and they want to make it much more difficult for Chinese manufacturers to get into our market here in the European Union, especially with the EU and Volkswagen being pretty tightly close together, So with manufacturers finding ways around these tariffs, I think surely the EU will be cracking down on manufacturers trying to, worm in around these rules. And I think with the T03, the EU might lean on the rule of origin and say that it is basically still a Chinese car, and that the value added may just simply not be enough, we don't think, in the European Union. But we actually don't know how much value is required. But if the EU can use flexibility or make their own assessment on this, and that's where the decision is made, based on that little bit of flexibility that they give themselves, how much value was added in Europe after the importation of the materials, then they will almost certainly decide on the answer that suits their agenda perfectly, I think. So they've done this a few times in the past year, specifically the EU tariffs. Before they'd even come out and said it, I think we were all kind of agreeing in the comments section. Basically, they're absolutely going to just tax crazily all these Chinese EVs coming, specifically SAIC, because SAIC is state-owned from China, MG4, basically. So it's sad, I think, that I have to take such a pessimistic view, because I'd really like to see these, cars like this being taken up in the European market and just have them everywhere. It's really confusing, because the EU is apparently hell-bent on being carbon neutral not many years from now, and they just really aren't helping the uptake of small, affordable EVs for the mass market. It's bonkers. It makes no sense to me at all. On the other hand, I can understand that there are some pretty strong underlying objections to Chinese EVs that might be justified. This raises the larger question of whether the EU will crack down on manufacturers doing things like this, and whether it will tighten up regulations in the future to make it even harder for cars on the lower end of the market. Let me know what you think, because I think there's quite a bit of substance to this video. I'm sure you have some things to say, but I'm really keen to see what you've all got to say, and I always really enjoy reading the comments, because there are some really clever people that watch. So feel free to have a rant in the comments and say what you like. I'll be really keen to read them.